Hey guys, Brass Facts here. Last time we talked about this thing right here, the preparedness pyramid, and how we can use something like it to help guide us on perhaps keeping our preparedness plans and purchases a little bit more reasonable. Today I want to use this pyramid to discuss proportional response and how you may be messing that up and how that might get you into some trouble. What do I mean by proportional response? The term comes from something I recall my poli-sci days, either referred to as proportional response or flexible response. I'll be honest, I don't recall if the story is actually based in any degree of reality, or it's just something I misremember. But it's my video, so I'm going to pretend it's real because it's actually just the entire genesis of why this video is titled the way it is. If you want to skip forward, you can actually just press the L key on your keyboard like 4 times. Historically, militaries only prepare for one thing, and one thing only, and that's to blow up other large militaries. Everything else was considered secondary to this objective. Enter the Cold War. The same was true, technically, and while some specialized units did exist at this point, they were very much part of the large army strategy, who, as always, were still oriented around beating the shit out of other militaries. But the Cold War was a massively different beast. Now, for the first time, war with a specific nation was to be avoided at all costs, which was an issue where nuclear employment existed at the end of the chain of escalation. Now, this is grossly oversimplified, but whatever, this is a preparedness video. The US realized it needed something outside of the standard chain of command that was the right tool for the right job, instead of always sending in advisors or 30,000 men as the solution for every single problem. The result of this was the birth of the modern special operations and expansion in the CIA mission set, and a surge in specialized technologies, groups, and more that we all kind of take for granted nowadays. That was JFK's both proportional and the bigger picture stuff, flexible response. All right, that's great, Brass Facts. What are you on about? I think there's a lot of people in the preparedness community that tend to be the metaphorical equivalent of that big conventional army war level of preparedness, both in capability but also in mindset. That's awesome. I think there's nothing more badass than Americans training to the highest level of capability. But the issue lies with our mental and physical inability to flex out of that mindset. Often when I confront people and talk to others about lesser scenarios, many still cling on to that highest level of capability, both in their execution, the mental component, and the gear choice. At this point, this sounds very clinical. Yes, of course, bring the right tool for the right job, big whoop. But I think, and I'm guilty of this too, it's far more common of an issue than you think. Go watch a YouTube channel, go look at every Instagram comment section, you name it. People are unable to separate themselves from the highest level of response and are unable to execute a proportional response. Okay, let's get into some examples, and I think it'll begin to make sense what I'm saying. Oh, by the way, I'm going to be referencing this chart all video, so I recommend going ahead and watching that if you want significantly more detail on each single one of the categories. But a quick rundown for those that forgot, need a refresher, or simply do not want to watch the other video because you only have time for one video on your break. Starting at the bottom, rule of law. Everything is working as mostly nominal. Obviously, there are some issues here or there. Crime might be high, it might not be, but rule of law is present. All things are nominal. If we move up, local disruption is, as the name implies, a very local, very short-term temporary halt of aspects of normal life, like rule of law, power, food, utilities, and more. It's a disruption. Think of a small section of a city under civil unrest, minor natural disasters, loss of power, whatever. Because it's local, though, other municipalities, other areas can kind of collapse in on the area of disruption and fix it in fairly short order. Regional disruption is basically the exact same thing, but it's significantly larger in scale. It also requires much more capable entities to basically step in, so there is a period of mobilization. Also, because of the large size, the problem gets addressed from outside in. So if you're in the epicenter of the disaster, the regional disruption, you may find the period of recovery to be significantly longer than any other scenario. And thus, because of the nature of recovery time, depleting resources, and so on, this ends up being a much more dangerous or difficult situation to navigate. However, both in disruption scenarios, the issue is self-rectifying. The system can handle this issue, albeit on, timescales. Systemic degradation, which is very similar in fundamental concept of the disaster present, is exactly that, but there's a degradation state. That is, the issue is not self-correcting, and fundamental enablers of society are compromised and not self-recovering. And then we have systemic collapse, which is just collapse. Everything is kaput. And at the extreme tip-top of that, we have complete, Mad Max loss of society. It's time for a detour, a Mountain House detour, sponsored by our boys over at Venture Surplus. I'm sure you know what this is, but for the few that don't, it's a bag that has freeze-dried food in it. And about 1 billion pounds of sodium, give or take. You add hot water, wait 10 minutes, and boom shakalaka, you got some food. Well, if we want to call this food, that looks like diarrhea. But yeah, personally, I tend to use Mountain Houses basically exclusively when I'm doing any kind of serious rucking activity. While the sodium will kill a small European child, it is very appreciated when you're actually really going after it and sweating out all of your electrolytes. And you want calories, flavor, and those electrolytes to be replenished in a fairly easy, lightweight package that you can kind of fit away and then burn off the trash or just pack out the trash easily. Venture Surplus has a bunch of Mountain House in stock right now, including this new flavor, tikka masala. It actually just kind of tastes like a curry version of teriyaki chicken. All right, back to the video. That's a lot of facial hair you got there, bud.
It's not actually, it's just spread out all the way. It's like moving the peas around on the table, so it makes it look like you had some.
Move the facial hair around, makes it look like you had some.
It's gonna be interesting.
Okay, there is a very practical issue with not correctly matching the response level to the threat presented, aka non-proportional responses. And I'm not really talking about like, oh, a home invader comes in, he only has a pistol, so you should only have a pistol, and don't use that 50 cal overkill. I don't care about that. That's not what I'm talking about. Go nuts. Or maybe don't go nuts with a 50 cal. I don't know. It's not legal advice. Whatever. I think this is more of an issue with public use of force, resources, and preparedness plans. I know I'll get flack for this, but I think a good example is civil unrest. We have all of this preparedness stuff that people are doing, all this awesome kit, night vision, thermals, drones, whatever. But then people say, oh, it's for civil unrest, which in theory can happen anywhere on the paradigm, but generally really happens mostly down here. There is a bit of tendency to want more firepower than a handgun, sure, but then we end up packing our car full of rifles, armor, ballistic helmets, comms gears, and more, which is not technically an issue in and of itself, but it does become an issue because most people are not willing to not bring these items should a situation occur that dictates maybe just a handgun with an extra mag is the proportional response, which is going to be 95% of the time. They will be unwilling to flex out of their maximum capability, even though the situation dictates. I hate to bring up the Kyle Rittenhouse situation, but he, in fact, is a pretty good example of this. He had a rifle, and that rifle ultimately allowed him to get out of the situation he found himself in. And he was legally allowed to do so. But having that rifle in the first place was the reason why violent rioters converged on him, right or wrong. Well, mostly wrong, and then engaged him without provocation. We can use some higher brain function to kind of separate ourselves from the scenario and kind of imagine if he had other options available to him, like concealed carrying a handgun, or maybe even a concealed PDW. In my opinion, the less effective weapon would have actually done more to protect him in the sense that he could have just avoided the fight in the first place by not sticking out like a sore thumb, while also still not giving up the ability to defend himself. People like to scream about how rifle rounds beat pistol rounds, and yes, of course, that's true. Yes, I know a PDW is a less effective weapon than a rifle. But in a situation like this, where 99% of the issue is simply just not getting in the fight in the first place, and situations like this require a heavy dose of luck, running around with a rifle in the middle of a riot is a great way to deal yourself a losing, unwinnable hand. Thus, I think the proportional response here is a concealed handgun, maybe a concealed PDW in a bag, or if you have a really good PDW on body. Let's try another example. Even in serious regional collapse scenarios, with significant periods of loss of rule of law, I indicated Katrina as a potential example of something that's happened in the United States. We may enter the realm where an overt rifle might enter the realm of proportional. So carrying around a rifle, which in typical times is generally not considered proportional, will actually be something that people are okay with seeing. It's a scary situation, and having the ability to defend yourself is considered acceptable in that scenario. Shit, even something like night vision might represent a proportional response as something for guard duty in a world that may be indistinguishable in the moment from a complete collapse scenario. But even then, you need to keep it reasonable at risk of materializing an escalating conflict from thin air over nothing. You are not the only person in this AO, and full infantry loadouts meant for systemic collapse won't actually do much in terms of capability, but will paint a target on your back without providing really anything in return. Most preppers and even non-preppers are distinctly aware that a lot of people right now are looking for an excuse to go Call of Duty death mode on their fellow Americans and will be on edge. And you wearing all this stuff is fitting exactly that bill. Much like the Kyle scenario, you will draw undue attention to yourself. And even from a mentality perspective, even if you don't run all this kit, but you're still locked in that full Mad Max mode, and we result in scenarios where we watch YouTubers show up in full-blown battle rattle with night vision, instead of simply just a rifle to go to their neighbor's house to go help them out with something. Obviously, that's fairly benign, but it's very easy to see that mentality and kind of locked-in mindset of viewing everything as an infantry fight causing problems if you bump into someone, say, that doesn't know you. These are Americans, these are your fellow citizens, keep it proportional to the threat index. And remember, the biggest challenge, the biggest foe in this scenario is probably going to be environmental and administrative and logistical in nature, and not a Rudy Tooty McTooty Flutie gunfight. Furthermore, from a very much more down-to-earth monetary stamp for proportional response, should you, say, only want to prepare for regional disasters and disruptions, so mostly natural disasters, but some man-made things, letting thought leaders on the internet convince you need $10,000 of nods, encrypted comms, the ability to engage targets at half a mile, is a great way to spend a lot of money on capability that is not even slightly proportional for your task at hand of preparing for a regional disruption. And that money obviously would be better spent on food, water, utilities, whatever, to keep you going in these scenarios. And if you got that checkbox covered, I mean, sure, go for it, but maybe also consider investments. But I already covered that topic in great detail in a number of videos, as well as the preparedness pyramid video. Go watch it if you want to, catch up. MFW when I load 30 rounds instead of 28. Hey, Hop, your gun's kind of cute.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I get pulled over, I want this to look really good in the passenger seat.
I'm not quite done yet. I think, obviously, proportional response has a lot of practicality in the moment of not painting yourself as a target. I also think there's a big issue with the lack of proportional response in online discussions and development of the community. Now, some people like to say online discussions don't matter, but I personally think how the community interacts with itself is a big reason on how we grow and how we're in a much better spot now than we were, say, in 2016 or 2014. Everyone has their pet theory of what SHTF might look like, and then assumes, unfortunately, that it is the only logical and extreme of what can happen. There's a tendency to view others as either over-preparing, and thus they're a friggin' LARPer, and everyone that prepares less than you is a sheep that will die in the first wave. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. If you're preparing for civil unrest as the most extreme scenario, dudes doing team tactics and NVGs will look stupid. Yeah, of course. If you are preparing for full-blown infantry-on-infantry combat, which is all the way at the tippy top over here, making statements like thermal is all that matters, drones are the new meta, and anything that is encrypted will have you kilted the sheets with a mortar strike on your position in 1 femtosecond. Yeah, sure, these statements are semi-factual from the perspective of this paradigm, but completely illogical should you be, say, within a regional disruption paradigm. Also, it's as an aside, I think this is why the preparedness community, generally speaking, gets observed from the outside as looking a little bit insane and playing army, but fuck them, they're missing out. At this point, before we wrap this up, I think it's a good reminder to remind you that I am an idiot on the internet, and this chart was made by said idiot. It's not a real chart, I made it up on the spot. Don't take this as written gospel, it's a visual aid to explain at what I'm getting at today. Proportional response. And the tendency for people to unfortunately kind of stay locked in at one level. Useful if exactly that level occurs, which is usually not the case, and very inconvenient if other levels occur. Let's flip the script here for a bit. Thus far, I've been describing disproportional response, bringing too much to a situation to the point where it causes issues. But actually, I think there's just as many scenarios where people under-respond to potential scenarios and preparedness conditions. Most people in 2024 admit that the circumstances that define non-reversible partial collapse scenarios are not only not far-fetched anymore, but increasingly likely. The world we live in, right? Systemic degradation, by its very nature, tends to be a failure mode that is not self-correcting without outside help, and thus tends to get worse, not better. As one system fails, it kind of tends to take other systems with it, and that tends to lead to degrading monopoly on violence, rule of law, first at the fringes and then more and more until large swaths of lower priority areas are basically abandoned by the social apparatus. The threat index in these scenarios is on a whole other paradigm here versus various states of disruption type events, be it simply massively increased violence on a daily basis or full-blown warlord status in abandoned regions of a country. Despite the CQB magnified rifles and engaging out to distance, night vision, thermals, team tactics, SOPs, recce, whatever is still viewed as LARP bullshit, despite us roughly knowing what an Op4 would look like in one of these situations and what you need to do to have a good chance of being successful. If you've already made the mental leap to say that these situations are possible, you might as well go all the way and understand what comes with that. There are many formerly first world nations that are slipping into failed state status, where this type of violence exists as the norm. And you can either pray you don't become a target, or communities can hire security or band together to form their own security. This doesn't just happen to poor African warlord nations that seem to keep being the backdrop for whatever Hollywood movie, but relatively formerly rich nations as well. Take a dart and throw it at that giant landmass to our south, and then do a road trip through it without care and see how long until you run into a checkpoint that is staffed by non-governmental actors. How about the formerly rich and now verging on failed state nodes in Argentina? Unless you are a community or a rich family that is able to hire or maintain their own regularly semi-well-trained armed guard, which seems to be acting as a pretty good deterrent. How about those Mormons in Mexico who keep getting into spats with the local cartel? Whatever it might be, the foe in these scenarios aren't just dudes that want your wallet at 1 a.m. next to the 7-Eleven back alley, but groups operating sometimes in broad daylight for personal gain or perhaps to fill a power vacuum left by an ever-weakening government. You're not to hear on anyone's story other than your own. Just having a rifle and expecting that to work out is massive underkill for stuff like this. The proportional response here is to combat an armed organized group is to be an armed organized group yourself. And that requires a lot of time, money, effort, and yes, that LARP training that you see on GunTube. I think that's what we do, right? Both as Americans with a culture of martial preparedness for whatever we might face, because that's just what we do, but also because you and your team may be all that stands in the way of your community and its subjugation or annihilation.
It's funny how she's just decided she's had enough.
She's like, everyone's awake. There's nothing to look forward to anymore.
I see.
I go back to sleep. The best part of the day is waking everyone up.
Yeah.
The best part of the day is over.
Jeez, dude.
Pretty sure it was like 20 degrees last night.